Hey, today we are ready for our Chapter 3 in Nightmare Mountain, written by Kehret. If you remember, the end of Chapter 2 brought some big problems as the model ship crashed to the floor, and Molly is thinking that Glendon may never speak to her again. Let's see what happens. Chapter 3, Nightmare Mountain. Bucky howled in the night. It was a loud, mournful howl, unlike any noise Molly had ever heard before. She shivered and pulled the blanket up tight under her chin. Bucky howled again. The primitive sound seemed weighted with sadness, and from somewhere across the field she heard the answering howls of a pack of coyotes. Molly opened her eyes and saw that lights were on. Bucky must be sick. Maybe he ate something he shouldn't have eaten. It sounded like he had a terrible stomachache. She wondered how far it was to the nearest vet and whether he could be reached at nighttime. "Ow!" wailed Bucky. The sound came from the other end of the hall, from Aunt Karen and Uncle Phil's bedroom. Molly got out of bed, put on her bathrobe, and went down the hall to see what was going on. Bucky sat on the floor beside Aunt Karen's bed with his head resting on the quilt. As Molly approached, he turned and gazed mournfully at her. His tail did not wag. Uncle Phil was talking on the phone. "The road isn't on the highway map," he said. "It's only on the National Forest map." She realized he was giving someone directions, telling them how to find the ranch. "Hurry," he said. "She needs help, fast." Molly stopped at the bedroom door. "What's wrong?" she asked. "It's your Aunt Karen," Uncle Phil said. "I can't wake her up. She seems to be in a coma." Bucky put his muzzle in the air and howled again. The sound sent chills down Molly's back. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked. "Yes, get dressed and take the big flashlight that's by the front door. Go down to the end of the lane and open the gate. An ambulance from town is coming out, and you can watch for it so they can find us faster." Molly turned and hurried toward her room. "Take Bucky with you," Uncle Phil said. Molly dressed quickly in jeans and sweatshirt. A coma? People in comas didn't move or didn't speak. It's like they were unconscious. "Come on, Bucky," she called. "Let's go, boy." Bucky didn't come. Molly ran back to the bedroom. "Here, Bucky. Come on, boy. Come on." Bucky leaned closer to the bed where Aunt Karen was. "Go, Bucky," Uncle Phil said. "Go with Molly." Uncle Phil's voice sounded scratchy, as if he had eaten too many crackers and needed a drink of water. Bucky stood up, looked once more at Aunt Karen, and trotted toward Molly. She found the flashlight on a table by the front door and clicked it on. Beaming the flashlight ahead of her, she ran down the lane. Her heart thumped in her chest. A coma? How could Aunt Karen be in a coma? When Molly went to bed, Aunt Karen was sitting in the blue chair knitting a sweater. That was only a few hours ago. How could she possibly be in a coma? Molly got a crick in her side from running, but she didn't slow down. She wanted to be sure she got to the gate before the ambulance came. Bucky raced ahead and then stopped and looked back, waiting for her to catch up to him. When they reached the end of the lane, the gate was already open. The metal rod which kept it propped open was in place. How odd, Molly thought. Who would forget to close the gate? Quickly she shined her light across the pasture, relieved to see that the llamas were all at the far side. If they had been near the lane, they might have escaped. She stood beside the mailbox and watched the road that led to town. Bucky paced nervously, sniffing the road, the gate, and the weeds. Molly wondered what was wrong with Aunt Karen. She had complained of a stuffy nose and sore throat at dinner time, but those were just the symptoms of a minor head cold. A head cold was one thing. Not waking up was something else. Molly thought a coma sometimes happened to people who were severely injured in an accident, or who had a stroke or maybe a brain injury. No one ever went into a coma from a head cold. She was pretty sure of that. Molly walked impatiently back and forth across the road. She had to move. She couldn't just stand there. How far did the ambulance have to come? There were advantages, Molly could see, to living in the city. Wailing sirens were a constant annoyance at home, especially in the summertime when she left her window open at night. Fire engines and ambulances screamed by regularly, breaking into her sleep. But those same sirens represented help in an emergency. If Aunt Karen lived in the city, an ambulance would already be here, and she would be on her way to the hospital. A glimmer of light behind her caught her attention, and Molly swiveled around to look back toward the barn. She could just make out the dark outline of the barn against the sky, and she peered toward it, wondering if perhaps she had glimpsed a shooting star. No, there it was again, a brief arc of light visible through the barn window. Someone was inside the barn with a flashlight. Was the baby llama being born? But who would be out there? She knew Uncle Phil was in the house with Aunt Karen. Maybe it's Glendon, she decided. Maybe he went out to check on the llama. She turned back to the road and peered once more in the direction of the town. Lights ahead, headlights and rotating red lights. Molly waved the flashlight over her head and the headlights speeded up. She aimed her light down the lane, moving it back and forth the way she had seen traffic cops do, to indicate where the ambulance should go. It sped right past her down the lane, the revolving lights casting an eerie red glow across the pasture. Just as Molly started to follow it to the house, the siren came on. It pierced the quiet night and echoed off the mountainside before it faded away, somewhere in the distance. A lone coyote seemed to answer it. "Here, Bucky," Molly called. She was sure Bucky knew his way home, but she thought the siren might have startled him. He was already acting so strangely, howling that odd yowl, and not wanting to go outside with her until Uncle Phil made him go. After checking to be sure the llamas were still on the far side of the pasture, she left the gate open so the ambulance could get out quickly. "Come, Bucky," she called again. She didn't want Bucky wandering away down the road. She didn't see him, but she could hear his dog tags jingling in the darkness behind her. The ambulance jerked to a stop in front of the house. 2 people in white uniforms jumped out and raced inside. Molly hurried down the lane after them. She went past the white ambulance with its red lights still going around and into the house. She could hear voices, but she decided against going upstairs to see what was happening. She knew it would be best if she just stayed out of their way. Bucky scratched at the door and Molly let him in. He trotted right past her and straight up the stairs. He's worried about her too, Molly thought. He's going to see if she's okay. Molly followed. She didn't want him bothering the medics. "Bucky, sit," she said when she reached the top. Bucky sat down near the door to Uncle Phil and Aunt Karen's bedroom. While Molly watched, he threw back his head once more and yowled. "Ow!" Glendon stood in the doorway of his room watching silently. One of the medics was talking on a cordless phone. Before she slipped into the coma, he said, her respiration was slow and gasping. "She's asthmatic but has never had a severe attack. We're starting out with her now. Tell emergency to watch for us." He hung up and he and his partner lifted Aunt Karen onto a stretcher. She was wrapped in a blanket and her face was the color of fireplace ashes. They hurried past Molly and down the stairs. Uncle Phil was right behind them. Glendon and Molly followed. "We're taking her to the hospital," Uncle Phil said. "Glendon and Molly, you will have to stay here by yourselves. I'll call you as soon as I know anything." Bucky trotted at Uncle Phil's heels, whining. "Keep Bucky inside until you close that gate," Uncle Phil said. "I don't want him running after the ambulance." Molly clutched Bucky's harness while Uncle Phil held the front door open. While the medics slid the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, Uncle Phil ran to his car, started it, and pulled out after them. One of the medics got him back with Aunt Karen. The other medic started the engine, and the ambulance roared away. Uncle Phil was right behind. Molly, Glendon, and Bucky stood in the doorway and stared after them until the red taillights disappeared in the distance. Molly held tightly to Bucky while Glendon closed the door. When she let go, Bucky scratched at the door and whined. "I guess we'd better go close the gate," Molly said. Glendon didn't answer. He just looked at her the way he had when the ship fell. It didn't bother her so much this time. Glendon was just weird and rude, but right then Molly was too worried about Aunt Karen to try to figure out what was going on with Glendon. If he wanted to stand there and stare at her, let him. Glendon walked slowly toward the stairs. When he reached them, he looked at Molly and said, "A dog howls that way when his owner dies. I've read about that in a book." Without waiting for her to reply, he turned and started up the stairs to his room. Molly watched him go, her stomach churning. Bucky pawed at the door and whined some more. "You have to stay in until the gate is closed," Molly said. Glendon apparently wasn't going to do it, so she supposed she would have to go back out and close it herself. She slipped carefully out the door, making sure that Bucky didn't squeeze past her. It seemed darker than before and colder. Molly shivered. She wished Bucky could walk along with her. "That's silly," she told herself. "You aren't scared to run down the lane and watch for the ambulance. Why should you be nervous now?" She glanced at the barn. All was dark. She had forgotten to ask Glendon if the baby llama had been born, but it must not be. Glendon wouldn't go upstairs to bed if the llama needed attention. A dark cloud covered the sliver of the moon, and the shadowy barn faded into the trees beyond. Molly shivered once more and then stepped resolutely off the porch and hurried down the lane. She was halfway to the gate when she thought she heard a noise behind her. She stopped and listened. For a moment she heard nothing more. When she shone the flashlight in a wide circle, she saw only meadow grass and trees. The sound came again, a sharp, abrupt noise, like a braying donkey with hiccups. This time she could tell it came from the barn. Merrylegs! She didn't know llamas made any sound except the happy hum, but what she heard was definitely an animal noise. Maybe the baby was coming. She walked faster, wondering how long it would take the ambulance to reach the hospital, wondering if Aunt Karen would be all right. She reached the gate, lifted the metal rod, and began to push the gate shut. As she did, an engine started behind her. Startled, Molly turned and looked around. As she squinted into the darkness, a truck, with no headlights, roared down the lane. For an instant, Molly stood still, paralyzed with shock. Her eyes widened in terror as the truck rushed forward out of the darkness, straight toward her. It was almost on her before she could react. At the last second, she leaped out of the way, flinging the gate open again and twisting her ankle as she stumbled into the pasture. She fell to her knees, tearing her jeans. Pebbles flew up from the truck's tires and landed like hailstones in Molly's hair. "Hey!" she yelled, but the driver either didn't hear her or didn't choose to stop. She watched the truck turn off the lane and head toward town. It was nearly out of her sight when the driver finally turned on the headlights. Molly was shaking with anger. She might have been killed by that stupid driver, going around with no lights, especially in the middle of the night. She yanked the gate shut and started to run. All she wanted to do now was get safely back to the house. She didn't know who had been in the barn or why they would drive away without any lights. She had been so startled when the truck came up from behind her and so anxious to get out of the way that she hadn't noticed who was driving. Maybe it was a veterinarian. Whoever it was, he had better learn how to drive before he killed somebody. By the time Molly reached the house, her breath came in short gasps and her twisted ankle throbbed. Bucky wagged his tail happily when she came inside. She reached down to pet him and he licked her hand. She thought about what Glendon had said. A dog howls like that when his owner dies. She hoped Glendon was wrong. Wearily, she locked the door and climbed the stairs with Bucky at her side. It would be comforting to have him sleep on the rug beside her bed for the rest of the night. When she passed Glendon's closed bedroom door, she hesitated. The way Glendon acted, she didn't want to talk to him any more than necessary. Still, she was shaken by what had happened just now, and she needed to find out who could be responsible. She knocked. "Glendon," she said. "Glendon, who was out in the barn tonight?" But Glendon didn't answer. And that's the end of our chapter. What do you think? Who was it in the truck? Who was in the barn earlier? We'll find out next time in Chapter 4.